For this project, you can use any size yarn you'd like, but I'm going to be using a size 5 bulky yarn because I want my scarf to be chunkier, and this is in the color Blossom Sorbet, and I used about 220 yards for this scarf, which was slightly more than 2 skeins. And then you'll also need a secondary yarn for the bows that we're going to attach, and obviously you'll need a crochet hook, and I'm using a size 6mm hook, but just use whatever size works for the yarn that you're using. And lastly, you'll just need a crochet needle to sew on the bows to the scarf. To start your scarf, chain the length you want the scarf to be, so start by tying a slip knot on your hook and then chain until you get the length that you want. Here are my chains. I did about 170, but feel free to make it longer or shorter, and you can even wrap it around your neck to see how the scarf would fit. And for our second row, you're going to start by chaining 1 as your turning chain, and then you're going to yarn over, insert into the first chain, and pull up that first loop, and then pull up the last 2 loops. So we're basically doing a half double slip stitch. So again, yarn over, insert into the next chain, pull over that first loop, and then pull over both loops. So the difference between this and a half double crochet is that for a half double crochet you yarn over twice, but for this one you're only yarning over at the beginning and then pulling over all 3 loops. So you're just going to repeat this stitch until you get to the end of the row. This is how your row should look at the end, and keep in mind this is the back of the scarf, so that's why the stitches look a little weird. But to start the third row, you're going to chain 1 and then turn your work, and we're going to be doing the same half double slip stitch, but instead we're doing it in the 3rd loop. So each stitch has 3 loops. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, again 1, 2, 3, and we're going into that 3rd loop, which is basically the loop closest to you. And you're just going to do the same half double slip stitch in that loop, and then you're going to do the same thing, and if it's easier you can count from the back 1, 2, 3 and go into that 3rd loop, and you're just going to be doing the half double slip stitches in every stitch until you get to the end of the row. If you look at the front side of the scarf, you can see that this knit-like stitch is starting to appear, and this is because by going into the 3rd loop, you're kind of popping out those stitches and making this really nice knit pattern. This is what your row should look like when you're done. And again, this is the back side, so that's why the stitches look weird. But now on row 4, you're going to chain 1 and turn your work. And now, as you can see, we're working on the front side because it has this really nice knit pattern. So for the front side, you're going to be doing the same stitch, but instead, we're going into the 3rd loop away from us. So on the back side, we were going into the 3rd loop closest to us, which was 1, 2, 3 right there. But for the front side, we're going to be going into the 1st, 2nd, 3rd loop away from us, and just doing the same half double slip stitch in each 3rd loop. So make sure you're always doing it in the loop furthest from you, and you're going to keep repeating this until you get to the end of the row. Once you're done with this row, chain 1 again and turn your work, and we're basically just going to repeat the same thing we did in row 3 and go into the 3rd loop closest to you. And again, you're just going to do this all the way across, and once you finish this row, you're going to repeat row 4 where we worked into the 3rd loop furthest from us. And you're just going to keep repeating and alternating these rows until you get the width you want for your scarf. I finished my scarf and I did about 15 of these alternating rows, and this is what it looks like. And now I'm just going to chain 1 and fasten it off, and you can just leave a short tail and weave it in later. But now we're going to add the tassels, but before we do that, if your project is kind of curling inwards like mine is and you want it to be flat, I recommend blocking it, which is basically a process where you soak it in warm or hot water and then just lay it flat to dry. And what it does is basically loosen up the stitches and give the scarf a more flexible and less stiff shape. So I'm just going to go block it, let it dry, and then we'll add the tassels. To attach the tassel, stick your hook from the bottom of the scarf and just stick it through the first stitch on one of the ends of the scarf, and then take all your yarn pieces from the center, so center them on the hook, and then you're just going to pull them through that stitch. And be careful because sometimes the pieces will fall off the hook or you'll lose some on the way, so just make sure you pull all of them. And then you're just going to make a little loop with these pieces and make sure to grab all of them. And then you're going to grab the yarn ends and pull them through the loop and pull tight to make a knot. Make sure you're pulling tight enough so the tassels stay secure. And there's your first tassel, so you're just going to keep attaching them all the way across this end, and I recommend waiting to trim them until you're done with all of them, so that way they'll be the same length. Here I'm just trimming all the way across the tassels, and I'm basically just cutting them to the shortest length to make sure that they're all even. So that's why I recommend waiting till you're done with all of them to trim them, so that way if some are shorter than the rest, you can cut them down to that length. So it doesn't have to be perfectly exact, but just trim them to around the same length. Now for the finishing touch on our scarf, we're going to add the little bows on the end, and as you can see, I did it on this white scarf that I made. So you're just going to grab your secondary yarn color. Mine is this off-white. And then you're going to take your hook and tie a slip knot on it, and then chain the length you want your bow to be. So this depends on how big or small you want your bow to be, but I'm going to chain 50. Make sure to keep loose tension with your chains so they end up wider, because it'll just look better when we sew the bows on. Here are my 50 chains, and then I'm going to make one more chain and fasten off. And when you fasten off, make sure to leave a really long tail, because this is what you're going to use to sew the bow on. So I made mine really long just in case, so I don't run out of yarn while I'm sewing. You can use any method you'd like to tie the bow, but for me, I like to match up the ends to make sure the chains are even. And then I grab both sides and make 2 loops, and then I just tie them together. And this definitely takes a few tries to get the bow even, but you can keep doing it until you get an even bow. So I just tie it and then pull the ends in the loops. This is the most even I was able to make my bow. It's not completely perfect, but once we attach it, it'll look even better. So to attach it, grab that crochet needle I mentioned at the beginning of the video and turn to the edge of your scarf. And then you can decide where you want to place the bow, but I'm going to place mine slightly above the tassels so it ends around there. And you can place it higher or lower, or even at the bottom so it blends with the tassels, and it's totally customizable, but I'm just going to do mine a little higher up. Now I'm going to show you guys how to actually attach the bow, and I'm going to try and get a good angle so you can see what I'm doing. But basically, you're going to place your bow where you want it attached. And then wherever the ends are or the tails fall, you're going to stick your hook underneath the scarf and pull the ends through the bottom. Mine is around that stitch, so I'm just going to stick my hook through the bottom and then pull the end through the scarf. For the other tail, you want to make sure it's even, so count how many stitches are between the tassels and your first tail, and then do the same space for the other side. So mine had 3 stitches in between, so I made sure my second tail was also 3 stitches from the tassels, and then just pull that tail through. To sew the bow, take the long tail and then thread it through your crochet needle. And then we're going to sew into these chains, and you don't have to sew into every chain. I recommend sewing into every other chain or even every 3 chains to go faster. So I'm not going to sew into the next chain, I'm going to sew into the 3rd chain after that. So I'm just going to stick my needle from the bottom through that chain and pull through. And then for the next stitch, stick your needle into the next chain, because you don't want to skip chains for when you're above the scarf, because then the sewing yarn will show, if that makes sense. So just put your needle in the next chain, and then once you're on the bottom of the scarf again, stick your needle into the second or third chain and just sew through. And then I'm just going to stick my needle in the next chain, which is near the knot of the bow. And then when you get to the loops, just do the same thing, keep sewing through every other chain or every 3 chains, but just make sure that the chains are facing up and that the back of the chain is being sewed down. And so yeah, you're just going to keep sewing through the chains until you get to the end. Once you're done sewing the chains and you're happy with how your bow looks, stick your needle through the last chain and then flip the scarf over. And now we're going to tie the ends together. So I just took my scissors and trimmed the long tail. And then I just tied the 2 ends together, and I recommend double knotting it just to make sure that they're secure. And then you can just use your hook to weave in the ends through the rest of the stitches. Now that we're done with the first bow, you're just going to repeat this on the other side, and then you'll be done with your scarf. And here's the final scarf. I'm so happy with how this came out, and I hope you guys were able to follow along and make your own scarf. So make sure to subscribe and follow me on Instagram, and I'll see you guys in the next video.